Westside Jeff in for Chris Krok. Chris is back tomorrow night. My story is born and raised up in the state of Ohio and fell into radio just by giving common sense opinion on current events. That's all I do. I follow the news, I read it, I analyze it, and find myself having an opinion. And Bruce Collins, the program director, thank you, Bruce, for giving me a shot, and said, yeah, you know what, I'll give you a shot. Put me on, and the rest is history. Here we are. Get a chance to give you common sense opinion on current events. You can follow me across social media at Westside Jeff. I had a buddy of mine, BJ Sugar. He is a partner in Sugar Shinar Law Firm who's in town for the weekend. I said, hey, BJ, stop over to the studio. Let's talk some legal issues, because there's a lot of things going on, legal issues in the news. Thanks for welcome down to the studio.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, you, Jeff.
Thanks for coming down Dallas. To the studios. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the stories that hit late last week that really caught my eye that I'm totally against, and that is the NCAA Power 5 conferences. They reached a deal to let schools pay players. Now, the proposed legal settlement also would involve $2.8 billion in damages for former and current college athletes. So what they've done is they've agreed to pay players to play for their schools, for their teams. I'm not a fan of this. Call me old school, but they're getting a free education. Number one. And number two is, if they don't like it, then don't go. Do something else. So now these kids coming up through high school have a mentality of, if I'm good enough, I'm going to go to college. They're going to give me a degree, even though I'm not there to study. And they're going to pay me to play for them. And that leads me into the career path of playing professionally, whatever sport it is. That is dangerous for our youth across our country, and that is dangerous for sports. I'm not a fan of it. I'm totally against it. It's a bad thing, and the governing bodies have got to fix it, period. You got an opinion? I want to hear it from you. 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. BJ Sugar joining me. BJ, let's talk a very specific example. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. You currently live there. Ohio State football team had a guy named Quinn Ewers make a commitment to Ohio State a couple years ago. He went there and earned $1 million or something like that in NIL. And he cut a deal with a local car dealer to drive their vehicle, and so on and so on. He wasn't good enough to play for Ohio State. He was the number 2 or going to be the number 3 quarterback. So Quinn Ewers entered the transfer portal and came here to Texas. That's what we're talking about. Now we're going to pay our players. Your thought?
Well, looking at what happened to Kyle McCord last year, I wish we would have had Quinn Ewers.
Yeah, quarterback at Ohio State that ended up transferring to Syracuse.
No, exactly. You know, I mean, Quinn Ewers understood at the time when Quinn Ewers transferred to Ohio State. Ohio was one of the only schools. Ohio was one of the states that had the ability for NIL. Texas did not at the time yet. So when Quinn made that commitment, he understood what he was getting into. I give him credit for doing that. He put his best foot forward, but Ohio State already had a quarterback carousel that was ahead of him. Quinn goes back to Texas. Texas then initiates their own NIL, so Quinn gets both the double dip hit, and now Quinn, is on the uptick with the Texas Longhorns football team, putting them on the map. They had a great season last year, but that's an example of the NIL. These rules are set, not even rules. These programs are thrown down, and then there's an expectation. Everybody tries to figure it out. I mean, people realize now after a few seasons with the NIL that only the biggest schools that have the biggest alumni are going to be able to give out the most money.
Texas is one of them.
Yeah, you're beginning to see contracts that started at maybe $20,000 to $50,000 to $100,000. Now you're in $1 million. You got Caleb Williams out at USC, who I think was almost up to $4 million in NIL money. He even contemplated sitting out the draft because he's maybe make more money as a quarterback at USC than he would have going to the NFL. So the pendulum is swung deeply the other way with the NIL. Now you come into this settlement over $2 billion in terms of paying former and current athletes. My question is how do they figure out what somebody is owed for being a former athlete, and how far back does it go, and what athletes are we talking about? You can't just say it's football, basketball, baseball. Every program,
Title IX.
Yeah, every program is going to be touched by this. It would be discriminatory to just say only these programs are able to get the settlement money. So I've not seen the details of that settlement, but I got to believe
messy
that it and then to begin to pay these athletes. Again, we're going back to the fact that is the pool of money coming out of the boosters? Is the pool of money coming out of the university budget? Where's the money?
Where in the budget?
Yeah, where in
the athletic department or the education side?
Are we going to raise tuition just so we can afford to pay the best players to come to the university? I mean, these are all questions that need to be smoked out, and they haven't done it yet. It's another example of throwing down policies without even understanding what the expectations might be and the outcomes might be in putting them in play. You're going to eliminate most universities. You're going to have basically two conferences left in college sports, those that can afford to play at this level, and the best players are all going to go to those universities, and 90% of the universities in this country aren't going to have a shot at some of the best five-star athletes because they're not going to have enough money to give to the players. So I don't understand or see what the strategy is in creating more parity in college sports. I think this is only going to create a true haves and have-nots situation, and we're going to end up just seeing the same teams in the finals every year.
And who's going to be the governing board for this?
Yeah, exactly. The NCAA looks like it's losing altitude.
Oh, God. It should.
And once they get wiped out, what is the governing body for college athletics?
And the different conferences could handle it very differently, right? Yeah. I read that right. So the SEC could do something different than the Big Ten, and so on.
Exactly. And that creates its own set of issues, where if one conference is doing it in a way that somebody likes and the conference is not, there's no parity across the system. There's no consistency. And without all of that, these dynamics, I think, will only hurt and harm the parity in college sports and create just a few handful of teams that can be able to afford the ability to build the best, quote unquote, the best teams money can buy.
And when you talk about college sports, most people you talk about college sports, you talk about this issue, they're thinking about football as we think about that here in Texas. Quinn Ewers, starting quarterback for Texas, right? Caleb Williams at USC. We are at Michigan University, who won the national title. What we're not thinking about is how this impacts male versus female sports. We're talking about basketball and football. What about women's lacrosse? What about women's diving and swimming? What about women's
softball?
What about women's hockey?
Track and field.
What about women's basketball and Caitlin Clark?
Yep.
Let's talk about that next on the other side of this. How does this, because this sets up for something really messy in the long run. Because it could be, football gets it all. What about the women's softball team? We'll talk about that next. That's BJ Sugar Shinar Law Firm. You can check him out online at war4214.com. It's a law firm right here in Dallas, also down in Houston, and 11 states across the country. I'm Westside Jeff, sitting in for Chris Krok. You can always hit me up across social media at Westside Jeff. If you have an opinion on this, if you're an athlete, I'd love to hear from you. If you're an administrator, I want to hear your take on it. If you are in a college somewhere as an employee, I want to hear your thoughts on the NCAA Power 5 Conference reaching a deal to let schools pay players. How do you feel about this? 800-288-9227. 800-288-WBAP. I'm Westside Jeff in for Chris Krok on News Talk 820 WBAP and now on FM at 93.3. So the NCAA has ruled on Thursday. One of the things I always tell you about is you got to watch out for the Friday afternoon news dump, especially going into a holiday weekend. And this was one of those. If you hadn't caught it, on Thursday, it was announced going into the Memorial Day weekend, the NCAA agreed to pay athletes of colleges for their athletic teams. And it's a big story. Jeff is my name, Westside Jeff. Born and raised up in Ohio, and been a radio a long time. I have 2 daughters, Danielle and Sydney. Both of them went to University of Cumberland's in southern Kentucky on the swim and dive team. Danielle was a diver, Sydney was a swimmer. So I have two kids, 2 daughters who were swimmers in a small college. I am totally against colleges paying their students to compete and for the colleges themselves to pay for it. I do not like NIL. I do not like athletes getting paid, period. You're getting a free education out of it. My attitude is, hell, if you're going to pay them, you know what? Make them pay for college. Make them pay the full expenses. Joining me is BJ Sugar Shannara Law Firm. I got a firm right here in Dallas called Sugar Shannara. You can find them at warfor214.com. And the other interesting thing, he's a buddy of mine from Ohio, still lives up in Columbus, Ohio. You're a part of a sports commission up there, right?
Yeah, I'm chairman of the Ohio Athletic Commission.
Which oversees?
Boxing, sports agents, UFC, and pro wrestling.
So you have a stake in this. You know what you're talking about. Your take on this whole thing. This is really messy.
You know, it's interesting. One of the facts that came out in the case was, the Power 5 conferences combined to total just over $3.5 billion in revenue during their 2023 fiscal years, according to their most recent federal tax records. So clearly these conferences are making a tremendous amount of money. And one of the issues that comes of this is, if you're going to pay the athlete, are they going to be considered an employee of the university or still be considered a student? Will they still be receiving, does the package include tuition and all of the other books and room and board? Or is it just going to be a salary that athletes get? What sports does this cover? Is this just basketball and football, or is this going to cover everything, including female sports as well? It's opening up a Pandora's box of, again, it's a decision that's being made without a true understanding of what it is going forward. Now, this actual announcement, the $2.8 billion settlement, is going to be split up in a number of different pools of revenue and paid over time to, I think it's a 10-year window for athletes who played 10 years ago. So that's what that's for. So the $2.8 billion is about what was earned in the past, not about what it is going forward. So setting up a system about how to govern this within the conferences is has still not been set. And again, that's something that's going to have to be talked about, because there's a lot of traps here. As you said,
yeah.
Jeff, with this.
It's messy.
In terms of how they're going to deal with it. We know the NIL has gotten out of control. I think it's one of the reasons why Nick Saban got out of coaching
Clearly.
college football, because I think he understood that the footsteps of cash were going to triumph over anything he had in terms of his program at Alabama. And I think he realized that that the system, basically what coaches now have to be, it's a full-time job not only to be coaching the team, but you're also going to have to be chief fundraiser in chief as well.
And trying to keep the
program.
team.
Yeah, and try to keep the team. So I think Nick Saban realized that and I just use him as an example, but I think he realized when you now go into coaching in college football, and I use college football as just an example because they're the biggest revenue generator when we talk about
and most visible.
Yeah, most visible. We talk about these topics. But now when you're a coach, not only are you going to have to be good at X's and O's on the field, not only are you going to have to be good at recruiting, but the third tier now is you're going to have to be good at raising money. You're going to have to be good at doing the rubber chicken circuit, so to speak, with the donors, making sure that the donors feel that you're vested in. So it's a third tier of the job, and a lot of these coaches are great at the X's and O's. They're great at the recruiting, but you know what? Not all of them are great fundraisers in terms of being able to be a Jimmy Johnson. I use that example in Dallas, a type salesman. Jimmy Johnson in the era of the NIL, had he been had he been around in this era, there's no doubt that he definitely had the best team that money could buy for whatever university he was coaching. I don't
see him sitting there glad hand.
Well, I will tell you, I think we suspect that the Hurricanes Hurricanes maybe at the time were already practicing the NIL before the NIL was allowed. But Jimmy Johnson would have been Jimmy Johnson is the type of coach that a university is going to be looking for going forward, because you're going to have somebody who can now not only coach a team, not only recruit, but you're going to have somebody who can fundraise. And having all three of those in a personality, Bill Belichick, arguably the greatest coach in NFL history,
won't work.
But I mean, I don't see him taking a lot of time to wine and dine the donors of an NIL. Nick Saban, same thing, great coach, but you can tell his patience runs thin, and if he's got to go out every night and wine and dine donors as a part of the program, that was good for him. I think that was a bridge too far.
The interesting thing about this whole NCAA thing is what you said at the very beginning of this is it's messy, it's murky, it's not even close to being determined yet. But will the players be considered an employee of the university? Because that opens Pandora's box. Think about an athlete that goes out and does an event, has a few drinks, gets in an accident, somebody gets injured, a lawsuit comes up, and they're not going after just the athlete. They're going back to university saying that player is a employee of your university and was there on official business, and they wronged us.
And that factor is being decided right now as we sit here at the National Labor Relations Board. There is a claim before the board to talk about this exact issue. They've not made a determination on it, but this deal here might fast forward that determination of whether these are going to be considered school employees or not.
And the other issue is, does a quarterback like Quinn Ewers get the same amount of money as a center? And does a center and Quinn Ewers get the same amount of money as the goalie of the women's hockey team, or the diver on the diving team, or the woman who is a tennis player, or the woman basketball player like a Caitlin Clark?
Yeah. No, all of those pools are going to have to be determined, and each university is going to have a different revenue-generating pool. The bigger universities are going to have a lot more money to divvy up in the revenues than a smaller university.
I'm not a fan. I got a problem with it. If you have an opinion, if you are involved in this, if you have a thought on paying college athletes, I want to hear from you. 800-288-9227. So the Dallas Stars won tonight in Edmonton. They lead the series 2-1. Two more games, they go to the Stanley Cup Finals. The Mavs play tomorrow night. They win tomorrow night. They're in the NBA Finals. We could be sitting here in 2 weeks with both the Stars and the Mavericks playing for their championship title. The last time the Cowboys did that was 29 years ago. I'm Westside Jeff, sitting in for Chris Krok. This is BJ Sugar Shinar Law Firm. You're a big sports guy. You sit on the sports commission up in the state of Ohio. I was born and raised there. He still lives there. Your take on that? We were just talking a moment ago. Would Jerry and Stephen Jones trade all their wealth for a Super Bowl? Do you think?
No, I don't think so.
I agree.
It sounds good, but
I agree with you.
I don't see it. I don't think they would do that. I mean, look, there are a few pieces away from delivery. I mean, the running back situation this year was not good.
They've
for
got
them.
No running backs.
Prescott, the offense is on his shoulders, which means because of no running backs, it had to be a pass every play. He had no ability for play action. The defense was great against teams that were below 500, but once it counted, they got ran over. I think, look, Mike McCarthy, I don't know if he's the right fit for the team. I think you got to get some fire and brimstone in there to really get these players fired up. And, we'll see what happens this year, but I didn't see any changes yet on the roster that tell me that they're gunning for a Super Bowl. And
here in Dallas, the pressure is on the Cowboys because the hockey team and the NBA team are both competing for the finals while the Cowboys are not. So this is a football town, and when your NBA team and your hockey team are competing for championships and your football team isn't, fans are going to be screaming.
Yeah, Mark Cuban sold his portion of the Mavs at the wrong time.
That's interesting. That's a whole different conversation because betting is not illegal yet here in Texas. And speaking of money and sports and betting, we're talking, that's BJ Sugar. I'm Westside Jeff sitting in for Chris Krok. Chris is back tomorrow night. We're talking about the NCAA Power 5 conferences reaching a deal to let schools pay players. A question I pose to you, as a listener of the radio station, how do you feel about the NCAA and Power 5 conferences reaching a deal to let schools pay players? How do you feel about the schools paying? This is murky. We've talked about it. BJ, you really framed it well. As we don't know exactly where the money's coming from. They're talking about paying past players. We're talking about how much do you pay the quarterback versus the center on the football team. We talk about football because that seems to be the most visible sport and the sport in which attains most money. But how do you treat the field hockey player on the women's field hockey, or the softball player on the softball team, or the lady swimmer on the swimming team at the University of Texas? As a listener, many of our listeners are educators. Many of you have worked in education. How do you feel about colleges? NIL is one thing. This deal with the NCAA is a whole different set of rules that's not really established. 800-288-9227. I want to hear your opinion on this. What are your thoughts? How are you framing this? What do you think about this? 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. BJ, how are they going to navigate male athletes versus female athletes and the star athletes versus the non-star athlete?
Well, and also the universities that are not in the Power 5 conferences. I mean, this was an agreement that was brought down to the Power 5 conferences. It wasn't. It doesn't seem like it was pushed on any of the other conferences across the country. So this will only affect the universities that are in the Power 5 conferences. The number I cited before, $3.8 billion just in 2023 alone, the Power 5 conferences generated as revenue. How are the other schools going to act? You're going to be able to adapt to a pay structure. If the Power 5 conferences are allowed to pay their athletes, what does that leave for the 90% of the other universities in the country that cannot? What's that going to do to that athletic program? What's that going to do to a university in Texas that's smaller but still at the NCAA level? How are they going to even be able to compete, not just in football, basketball, baseball, but in the other sports? The other sports haven't been brought up in this suit, in this predicament that they're talking about paying the athletes. So all of these things are an unknown, and all of these things, if not taken into consideration quickly, can get out of hand very fast. And
then the other issue comes into play is, let's talk football for a minute. A student athlete gets paid to play football. Not only NIL, but the NCAA pays for them. They take some kind of a serious injury that knocks them out of the potential to play pro football. Does he have right to go back to college and sue and make money off that deal if you have a career-ending injury?
That's an interesting point, Jeff. I mean, if they're technically employees, are they going to be able to apply for workers' compensation?
Workers' compensation. That's where I was going.
Yeah, I mean, if you get hurt in the line of duty as an employee, you have rights to go for workers' compensation. How is that going to affect the workers'
I see the look in your eyes. You hadn't thought about that.
No. That's a great angle, and maybe I should be getting into workers' compensation if that's the case.
Sugar Shannara.
I'll get the I'll sponsor the golf cart on the football field when they come to grab the player.
War4 214.com. 800-288-9227. 800-288-WBAP. Carol from Dallas, thanks for listening. You're on the Chris Krok Show with Westside Jeff and BJ Sugar.
Hi there. Listen, my feeling is that if these athletes get a full 4-year scholarship, isn't that enough payment? Instead of really, this is going to be a mess and a blender as far as who's paying who and what. It's going to be devastating. I think a 4-year scholarship would be enough payment for this time in their life.
Carol, you're singing from my hymnal on that one, and my attitude is forget the scholarship, make the kid pay for college then if you're going to pay him NIL and pay him to be a student athlete, so to speak. You're right on this.
And it's interesting, Carol, you're dealing with increased tuition rates throughout the country for universities at the same time now that we're talking about paying the athletes above and beyond what they're already getting as a full ride.
You're spot on with that, Carol. Any other thought there?
No, except I would have liked to have been paid to have been a housewife.
Yeah. You know what? BJ Sugar can defend you on that one. You can check him out.
Yeah, give us a call, Carol. We'll take a look at it.
War for214.com. If your husband made a ton of money, maybe it's worth it. If not, then just kiss him goodnight, right, Carol?
Okay, thanks so much.
All right, Carol, thanks for listening. I appreciate you calling the show. Again, if you'd like to weigh in on this topic, I'd love to hear from you at 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. There's a lot of issues about paying college athletes. This ruling came down on Thursday. It hit the news Friday going into a long holiday weekend, and it's kind of a story that's going under the radar at this point. But this is a pretty sizable story. And the question, BJ, is where's the money coming from? This is coming from the NCAA and partially the universities. Is this media rights? Where are the funds? Is this money that I'm donating to my college coming back to pay athletes?
It appears that the damages pool is going to be cut from a lot of media revenues, and partly the $3.5 billion, for example, in 2023 that the power conferences were able to garner in revenue. From my understanding and looking at the breakdown, that's part of the pool that these monies will be pulled from. And then going forward, there'll be some type of revenue share that they're going to implement.
It's a fascinating story. On the heels, let's apply it to what's going on now. We have the biggest star in college basketball this season isn't on the men's side. It's been the women's side. It's Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark was making several $1 million playing basketball for Iowa. She forewent that to go to the WNBA, and her salary of the WNBA, I think, was $70,000 or $80,000 is what she's being paid to play for the Indiana Fever, but she's making a lot on sponsorship. She probably would have made more money staying in college. So now this ruling comes out, and now athletes going to get paid above and beyond NIL, so she could double dip.
Yep. And being in a big university, that double dip is going to be worth millions of dollars and only increase unless there's a cap there at some point.
And the question there is she going to make as much or more? She has brought more notoriety to the University of Iowa than any other athlete at Iowa. Do you anticipate she would have been the highest paid player in the Iowa athletics department over somebody in the football team or any other team?
Absolutely. She made more money than the president of the university.
But do you think if this were in play now, she'd make more?
Oh, yeah, because she would have doubled. Yeah, she would have had double dip. She would have a salary and the NIL and endorsement deals that she had while she was playing. She would have made more money.
I'm totally against it. This also, to me, this plays in. Think about this. How does this impact the U.S. Olympics, the Olympic team?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because many of those athletes on the Olympic team, on those gymnastics and track, they're college stars.
Yeah, they're going to be. They would fall under this as well as getting paid as athletes going forward.
Let's talk about that next. Westside Jeff in for Chris Krok. That's BJ Sugar joining me here on News Talk 820 WBAP and now on FM at 93.3. Westside Jeff is the name, and for Chris Krok. Chris is back tomorrow night. Joining me is BJ Sugar. He is the partner in a law firm, Sugar Shannara, here in Dallas. He's also got an office down in Houston and also down on the border in McAllen. And he's got offices in 11 states. Sugar Shannara. So if you need an attorney or help with a case, you can reach out to them online at warfor214.com is their website, or call them up at 877-WAR-4, the number 4, YOU. So they do a lot of cases and represent a lot of folks. We're talking about legal issues because he's a legal expertise on things. I want to hear from you, your thoughts on the topic we're talking about. The NCAA On Thursday, a ruling came out. The NCAA and Power 5 conferences reach a deal to let schools, colleges pay for players. This isn't just NIL. This is the colleges paying their athletes to be athletes for the university. Brings up a lot of questions. And to me, one of them is, are they employees of the university? How do you pay a student athlete to play football, basketball, baseball, softball, whatever the sport is, and not make them an employee of the university? And then if they take an injury, how do you get around, or don't you, workers' comp? But then the other thing comes into play. A lot of these athletes are making money now on NIL. Now the schools are going to pay them. How does that play out for the Olympics? We're coming up on the Summer Olympics this year. Many of those gymnasts will be college athletes. Many of the swimmers will be college athletes. The softball players will be college athletes. Across many of the sports we watch on the Olympics, they'll be college athletes. So what happens if one of them gets injured? There's a lot of issues here. So the question I ask BJ Sugar joining me, BJ, who rules on whether or not they will be employees or not?
The National Labor Relations Board will make that determination, and that's a board that's appointed by the President of the United States in staggered terms.
And that'll hold true on what they determine. Will the NLRB leadership change with an election? Right now, those are folks appointed primarily by Biden. Will it change if Trump wins?
It takes time. So they're staggered terms in the National Labor Relations Board. So whoever the next president is will have another nominee to be nominated to the board. So the makeup of the board isn't going to substantially change. It's going to take a few years in an administration in order to put your imprint on it. When President Trump was president, he was able to appoint a number of people to that board. And then when those terms expired, President Biden then nominated and appointed his people to that board. So I don't know what the exact makeup of that board is. The interesting part about this issue is it's very unique because of the athlete aspect to this. The fact that they're also students at the same time, but they're also going to be potentially categorized as doing a job. You know, the NCAA does not want them categorized as employees because, as you pointed out, Jeff, it opens up a whole different avenue of other circumstances than if they're just students. But if you're going to pay them as for doing a job and it's not an NIL, you know, if it was just the NIL we were talking about, then they wouldn't be considered employees, at least in my estimation, because those are endorsement deals. Those are not paid for specific services or quote unquote jobs at the university. But if you're going to formally begin to pay them as a salary,
you have to.
Yeah, then there's
no other way.
You're going to open up yourself to potentially making them employees, and then that's going to have a whole different bucket of issues that I don't think they're even thinking.
They're going to get a check from their university unless it comes from the NCAA. Now, if the check comes from their paycheck comes from the NCAA, they're an employee at NCAA, right?
Correct.
Will that change whether it comes from the University of Texas, or the NCAA? Will that impact it?
Well, the NCAA would then be considered the employer. So,
and then again, if they get injured while playing that sport,
the NCAA could have a huge umbrella workers' comp policy. They would have to in order to cover that.
This is an ugly, ugly deal. And I say, no, don't pay athletes. BJ, thanks for joining me to talk about this. I
Jeff,
appreciate
a pleasure, man.
Sugar Shannara is his law firm. Thanks for coming down to Texas for the weekend. I appreciate it. If you want to check him out, war4214.com. Again, Westside Jeff in for Chris Krok. Chris is back tomorrow night on the other side of the top of the hour news here with Sean Allen. We'll talk about the storms in the area, but also the destruction up in Valley View and how that impacts us right here in our community. I'm Westside Jeff in for Chris Krok on News Talk 820 WVAP and now on FM at 93.3.